Okay, so story time, but not one of my stories. This is actually a story from a friend of mine, Sherm Cohen, and he gave me permission to share it. So I will tell you about it. It was a hot summer day. He was driving from the valley down all the way down to downtown for a comic convention that was there. And he didn't have air conditioning in his car, and he didn't get the comic that he wanted at the convention. So he was driving back very frustrated and hot and sweaty. And he decided to stop at a Bob's Big Boy and go in and get some food. And the next booth behind him had some loud kids who were just sort of getting on his nerves. And then one of the kids started kicking his table, and he was just like, oh, and he was getting so frustrated. So he got up and he went into the bathroom, and he was washing his hands, and he looked up in the mirror, and he saw on his forehead the word hurry, like printed on his forehead in Helvetica bold. It wasn't like somebody drew it on there. And he was like, who could have put this on my forehead? And he was looking around like, what the? And there wasn't anybody there. And he was like, oh my God, it's really printed on my forehead. And it must be printed mirror backwards on my forehead so that I can read it. He hadn't touched another person. No one had come up to his head and touched it or put anything on him the whole day. He couldn't figure out how this could possibly magically be on his forehead. And he was like, well, then I better hurry. So he ran out and he threw some money down for his food. Didn't even get his food. Got in the car, drove all the way home to the valley, looking in the mirror all the time to make sure that it wasn't disappearing. He wanted to get home. He looked at the mirror at home, and it's, how could this possibly have happened? And he started going through everything that happened that day. And he'd gone to the Comic-Con, he was driving back home, he was all hot and sweaty, decided to stop at Bob's Big Boy, and then he stopped there and he was just like reading the newspaper, and the kids behind him were irritating him, and then they started kicking his chair, and he just put his forehead down on the table on the newspaper that he was reading. And what had apparently happened is he was all hot and sweaty, and he put his forehead onto an ad that said, hurry, was probably followed by sale ends soon or something like that. And it had just printed that right onto his forehead so that when he got up and he went into the bathroom, it was there. So he drove back to the Bob's Big Boy to see if he could find the LA Reader that he had picked up there, to see if he could find the actual ad that had printed on his forehead. And when he got there, a truck had run into the side of the Bob's Big Boy, destroying the table that he was sitting at. So if he had not hurried, he would have been sitting in that table. That's the only part of the story I made up. Everything else is true. That didn't happen. He didn't drive back and see the place all crashed. But I will say this. I remember a time when a truck did run into that particular Bob's Big Boy and smashed through the door. And it was in the early 90s, I believe, which was about when this would have happened to him. I like to think that it was on that day that he had to hurry out of the Bob's Big Boy. That's how it ends in my mind.